Welcome to the Invite Health podcast, where our degreed healthcare professionals are excited to offer you the most important health and wellness information you need to make informed choices about your health. You can learn more about the products discussed in each of these episodes and all that Invite Health has to offer at www.invitehealth.com/podcast. First-time customers can use promo code podcast at checkout for an additional 15% off your first purchase. Let's get started.
Probably heard of iron deficient anemia, but are you as familiar with iron overload, also known as hemochromatosis? This is certainly a problematic condition. It is actually a genetic condition. It is autosomal recessive, and it's, as a matter of fact, the most common autosomal recessive disease in the world. So looking at hemochromatosis, this is an area that many people, it's estimated 1 out of every 300 people have hemochromatosis. So I want to talk about this in some detail and talk about what you can be doing if you happen to have a tendency to have iron overload. So I'm Amanda Williams, MD, MPH, and let's get right to it. Let's talk about what hemochromatosis actually is. We know that this is this abnormal accumulation of iron that goes to other organs. It can go to the brain, certainly into the liver, and it creates a toxicity, which is a big issue. Now, one of the biggest problems is that roughly 75% of people who have hemochromatosis are generally asymptomatic, and they don't even know that they have iron overload that's occurring. Now, some of the early symptoms that many people can experience is things like fatigue. And generally, when we think about fatigue, we think about iron deficient anemia. But the same thing can happen when we have iron overload. We can also look at just kind of arthritic symptoms that occur. And we can also look at this being very common in men is issues with being impotent. Now, we know that hemochromatosis is certainly more common in men than it is in women. It roughly affects men about 2 to 3 times more often as it does women. And women who have iron overload generally become more symptomatic later in life than men. Men will present with this much earlier throughout their life, and we can look at the impact of that. We can look at cirrhosis and the correlation between cirrhosis and people who have hemochromatosis. We can look at diabetes. The reason why diabetes and hemochromatosis go together is because of the iron deposits that occur within the pancreas. So this can actually create a situation of inadequate pancreas secretion of insulin, hence leading to diabetes. And many times people don't even look at these things. And certainly we can look at the arthritic symptoms that can occur where there's just constant pain within the joints, but it's not falling into that category of, say, osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis. Now we can look at more of the significant issues that can be impacted when we think about the cardiac symptoms. And if we end up with too much iron that actually gets deposited within the cardiac muscles, this can really create a problem because now we're dealing with the electrical conduction system. And so we can start to end up with these true cardiac arrhythmias. And this can be incredibly problematic. So we can be dealing with things like heart failure and cardiomyopathies and arrhythmias, left ventricular heart failure. And this is all brought on because of excess iron. Now, iron can also deposit itself in the thyroid, which can lead to hypothyroidism. So there's a lot of ways in which people can have the iron overload that's occurring in the body and they don't even realize it. You may go in and you're sluggish and you feel kind of achy and your thyroid levels come back looking a little squirrely and they say, oh, you've got hypothyroidism, and never realizing that the main issue from this is coming from iron overload. So it's always advantageous, if you don't know that you have a family history of a particular genetic mutation, which is the HFE gene. If you know that, then of course you're going to stay on top of always going in and checking your iron levels and maybe potentially having to have bloodletting, as one would say, to remove a lot of that excess iron. But if you are not aware of any type of family history of iron overload, then it's advantageous that if you're having kind of these really vague symptoms, that you do go in and you have a comprehensive iron panel drawn, so you can actually see what's going on with your iron and your ferritin and have a better picture or a better idea. Because if in the event that you do have iron overload, you need to make sure that you stay on top of that. Now, we know that there are many different nutrients that have been shown to help regulate iron levels. We know that vitamin C is an iron binder. So if someone has iron overload, they have to be very, very careful with how much vitamin C that they're actually supplementing with or taking in via dietary wise, because the vitamin C can actually make it worse. Now you have someone with the opposite issue. They have iron deficiency. Definitely they want to be taking vitamin C to try and bind up that iron and maintain it. But if you have too much iron, you have to be very careful with your vitamin C intake. But we know things like lactoferrin are really, really helpful when it comes to binding and the removal of that excess iron. Now, where do we find lactoferrin in a very high amount? Oftentimes 5 to 7 times more lactoferrin than any other source is in colostrum. So we actually carry colostrum. So if someone is known to have this issue with high iron stores, then it would be advantageous to include colostrum into your daily routine. Now, there has been multiple studies. There was a real interesting study done at Georgia State University where they were looking at green tea as well as grapeseed extract in the prevention of iron overload. So they were looking specifically at HFE, that's that gene mutation, so that's hereditary hemochromatosis, this genetic disorder that results in the excessive accumulation of iron throughout the body. And this is, due to that inappropriate high intestinal absorption of iron. And they found that when they were looking at utilizing these polyphenols coming from green tea and from grape seed extract, that this did a really wonderful job. Those bioactive components, those polyphenols, did a really good job in terms of being able to mitigate the negative impact of that intestinal absorption of iron. And they found just through their preliminary data that this is very feasible. By using just green tea and grapeseed, this enough made a huge impact as having this therapeutic potential for iron overload disorders, which is very, very promising. So this is why I wanted to bring this up, because many times, like I said, we talk about iron deficiency, but we don't think about iron overload. So when you have iron overload, obviously you're going to be limiting your dietary intake of iron, which you should be anyways, in a sense, with that red meat. But there are certain vegetables, green leafy vegetables that can be high in iron, and beans and things like that. So if you do have iron overload, you do always want to be very careful with your actual iron that's coming from your food. And then we have to avoid too much vitamin C. And then we want to include in those polyphenols, including green tea, so the EGCG, including grapeseed extract, the power of those oligomeric proanthocyanidins, and of course, lactoferrin. Now we can look at other things. We can look at studies showing milk thistle as being very beneficial. We can look at studies that have utilized curcumin extract. Carnitine has even been shown to be beneficial. But the main focus of the very, very promising research is in that setting for lactoferrin, which is found in our colostrum, the green tea, and that grapeseed extract. So iron overload disorders. Certainly not something that you want to, play around with, because we know that the long-term damaging effects of having too much iron in the body can be detrimental long term. So when we think about the impact to the liver, when we think about what's happening to our endocrine organs, including the pancreas, thinking about the thyroid, even when we look at, bone loss and damaging effects within the joints. So the heart, the liver, every single system, including the brain, are certainly impacted through this. And they've even linked, iron deposits in brains of people who have Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis. So we know that the iron overload is certainly problematic. We want to make sure that this does not become a long-lasting problem. If you do have a genetic, inherited condition, then obviously you want to make sure that you are for surely staying on top of this so your body is not negatively impacted by that iron building up. So that is all that I have for you for today. I want to thank you so much for tuning into the Invite Health podcast. Remember, you can find all of our episodes for free wherever you listen to your podcasts, or by visiting invitehealth.com/podcast. Now, do make sure that you subscribe and you leave us a review. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and we will see you next time for another episode of the Invite Health podcast.